Hi, everyone, and welcome again to our Outside In Ecology sessions. And I really appreciate everyone who takes time out on a Sunday morning to do this. I'm not going to introduce the topic and the speakers. I'm going to make Jayashree do that, in fact. And Jayashree heads the MSc Wildlife program at NCBS. We just want to say that this is going to be a really, really interesting topic and a really interesting session. Whenever we've worked with Jayashree, we've always found some of the most engaging things that we've ever done. So I'm actually going to ask Jayashree to do it. And a big shout out to Sodhamani, whose idea this was, the Outside In sessions. We are on at Sunday mornings and we talk about ecology. And it's not just Bangalore Life Science Cluster speakers, but speakers from anywhere around the country or even around the world who have stories to share. So Jayashree now, who is the head of our MSc Wildlife program at NCBS, to tell us a little more about the speakers and a little more about what we're going to be talking about today. Jayashree?
Yeah, I come in just for a minute. I'm Sodhamini, and thanks to the communications team for taking this idea through and doing it so beautifully. And I wish to also thank Dr. Jayashree Ratnam for agreeing to participate in this morning session. And welcome to all the participants at another eclipse day in some parts of the world. Yes, yeah, Dr. Jayashree Ratnam had done her master's in computer science in BITS Pilani, and then she did another master's, but in ecology, where she got trained in this area. And she's been heading this wildlife MSc Wildlife program for now, some years now. And talking about the master's program, it has been definitely as a bunch of people whom we are continuously jealous about. In NCBS and in the biocluster, because here we are in front of test tubes or computers and looking at our things and research, but these people are out there feeling really happy in the wild and not so wild places. Keep smiling. Yeah. So Jayashree, I would request you to start off the session and then introduce the alumni, because they are also doing very well. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. And it's great that you're all here to join us on this Sunday morning. So as I was introduced, I run a master's program in wildlife biology and conservation that is housed at the National Center for Biological Sciences. And today, just before our speakers get talking, I thought maybe I just wanted to tell you all a little bit about what does that mean? What does it mean if you're studying wildlife biology and conservation? Okay, so first let's just start with biology as you learn it in schools. Now, when you're doing basic biology in schools, you will learn about cells, the organelles in cells, the processes in cells, mitosis, meiosis, the classification of plants and animals, their digestive and reproductive systems, how they're classified, and so on. But typically, we stop there at the organismal level. In wildlife biology and conservation, there are two things that we do quite differently from that, and we scale up from basic biology to study wild animals and plants, importantly, in the natural habitats in which they live. And secondly, we scale up from studying individual organisms to populations, communities, and in some cases, ecosystems. So we're talking about a difference in scale when you go from biology, as you study it in schools, to wildlife, to the study of wildlife biology. The other important part in that title is the word conservation. And a key point that wildlife biologists and conservationists try to focus on is that they try to understand what are the threats to the populations of wild plants and animals that they're studying. And today, almost most of nature on our planet is threatened. And it is it is very important to us to try and find out what threatens it. Typically, threats to wild animals and plants may range from things like habitat loss, hunting and poaching, to disease, all the way to climate change. And the main threats may differ from place to place. So for example, while an elephant population in one place may be threatened by poaching, In another place, it may be threatened by disease. So wildlife biology and conservation then refers to the study of wild animals and plants in the habitats where they occur and trying to quantify whether a given population that you're studying is healthy or threatened. And if it is threatened, then what threatens it? Okay. Now, the big thing is that wild animals are really hard to study directly, right? It's going to be very difficult for you to walk into a forest and directly study elephants or tigers. As a consequence, wildlife biologists use a number of different methods to indirectly study animals. And in doing this, they often end up using a lot of technology. So for example, if you want to find out how many tigers there are in a given forest, you will often do it using camera traps. Or you might use the acoustics or the sounds made by animals to understand something about where they occur and in what numbers they occur in a given forest or a grassland. You may also end up studying animals by seeing indirect signs, such as their nests or the trails or their droppings, right? So as a consequence of this, when we study wildlife biology, we often end up using a lot of technology. And in order to use this technology, we often use a lot of fundamental principles from the basic sciences. And as you will see in our talk today, for example, our speakers who are both going to talk to you about using acoustics to study natural animals end up using a lot of basic principles from physics. Okay. And finally, because we are studying populations and communities, wildlife biologists and conservationists also have to have a lot of quantitative skills, because we're not talking about one animal, we're talking about populations, birth rates, death rates, dispersal, immigration. And in order to describe all of these, you need to do so quantitatively. So we also end up using a lot of mathematics and statistics in our discipline. So wildlife biologists and conservationists then end up being very multidisciplinary and using a lot of principles from the basic sciences. And as if all that wasn't enough, if you're really interested in going out there and conserving some animal, it is often not enough just to know the biology and what's threatening it, but you have to understand the ecological and social context in which it is set. So as a result of that, wildlife biologists also have to have some level of competence in the social science. So it is a wonderful multidisciplinary and applied science. And the best part of it is, not only do you get to go out and spend time in nature and watch beautiful plants and animals, but if you do it right, the knowledge that you generate is going to help to conserve the magnificent wildlife and wild animals and plants that we see around us. And today, what you guys are going to do is hear about two such studies from alumni from our program, Shasank Ongole and Mayukh Dey. And both of them used acoustics to study their respective study animals. In the case of Shasank, he used acoustics to study bats in coffee plantations, and Mayukh used acoustics to study the gangetic dolphin in the underwater riverine habitat in which it lives. And with that, I'm just going to hand it over to them. And Shasank, I'd like to hand it over to you now for your talk. So Shasank will speak first and then Mayukh.
Thanks, Jayashree. And thanks to Sadamini, the BLISC Communications Office, for this opportunity. Let me just share my screen. And can you see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. So first, I'll talk a little bit about insectivorous bats in general, which will make it easier to understand when I come to my research. Right. So the first question we asked is, when did bats evolve in the first place, and why are they nocturnal to begin with? So when the earliest ancestors of bats began to evolve around 70 million years ago, they faced a lot of competition for food during the day, specifically from birds. So then they had to evolve to be nocturnal because the environment was changing. So as time went on and insect diversity also increased somewhere around 50 million years ago, the modern bats that fed on insects began to emerge and take over the world. In this slide, you can see on the left, the picture is of a fossil of a bat from Germany. This is dated around 69 million years ago. So if you look at the structure of the fossil, and then the structure of the photo on the right, so that's a modern bat. So they look very similar. So you can see and say with a fair degree of confidence that the fossil is that of a bat. So then for a long time, people asked, how are bats able to fly around in complete darkness? So even back in 1795, this person on the left, an Italian called Lazzaro Spallanzini, he also wondered the same thing, and he first took a shot at answering that question. So he realized that maybe it has to do with one of the five senses of sight, smell, touch, taste, and hearing. So then he began to conduct experiments to figure out which one of these things. For example, when he decided to check if bats used sight, their eyesight, to fly around, he covered these bats with a hood and let them fly. And then if they faltered a little bit, then you know that it's because of the sight that they're able to navigate in complete darkness. So he used these kinds of experiments to figure out which one of these senses it was. And in the end, he thought it has to do with hearing. But of course, in 1795, he didn't have the necessary equipment to exactly pinpoint what it is that bats were actually listening to and what it is that they were emitting. So it was only in the 1930s, this gentleman on the right called Donald Griffin and his colleagues, they figured out that bats emit and listen to really high frequency sounds in order to be able to fly around.
Hi, Shashank. I'm really sorry to interrupt, but there seems to be a gray, a patch of gray on your PPT. Yeah, it's reducing now.
Still there?
Yeah, so it's reducing now, but there were patches of gray on your screen, so the screen wasn't visible.
Is it gone? No?
Yeah, it's gone now. There's one little bit left at the bottom right hand corner.
Bottom right corner. Okay, everything seems to be fine here for me.
It's gone.
Still see it?
There's a little bit, but it's mostly gone.
Okay, great. Okay, fine. I'll move on then, yeah? Hello?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So before we go further a little bit, I want to refresh the physics of sound. So when sound travels through the air molecules are compressed and then they expand and then do that repeatedly. And that's how the sound travels from one point to another. So you can sort of visualize that sound in terms of a wave like this. So some terms that we generally use are, for example, amplitude, which is the height of this peak. So the higher the amplitude, the louder the sound. So then you have this term called wavelength, which is the distance between these two depressions here. Or it can also be the distance between the two peaks. And the frequency is nothing but 1 by wavelength, or wavelength is 1 by frequency. So if the wavelength is high, then the frequency is low. If the wavelength is low, then the frequency is high. So these basic concepts of physics are very useful in trying to understand bats. So if you look at human speech, for example, and hearing, the range of frequencies that we hear are somewhere between 0.02 kilohertz to 20 kilohertz. So on the right side here, you see a visual representation called a spectrogram of a sound. So on the x-axis here, you see time in milliseconds here. And on the y-axis, you see frequency, which is in kilohertz. So this representation is of two words said by a person. The two words are O and No. So you see here that the yellow parts in the spectrogram are essentially the louder ones. That is, the amplitude of those parts of those frequencies are very high. And then these red areas are low amplitude ones, so they're very weak. So essentially, what you can see is that most of the sounds that humans make are in the range of a few kilohertz. In this particular case, maybe around 2.2 kilohertz. Right? On the other hand, the highest recorded frequency in bats is around 212 kilohertz. That is unbelievably high, right? And we definitely cannot hear it. So, but thankfully, after 1930s, when high frequency sounds were we were able to measure them and hear them, now we can use these instruments to bring the frequencies down to our hearing range, so we can actually hear them. So I'm going to play a recording for you, which I did during my field work. And I'll point out to you that in the beginning, towards the beginning and the end of this recording is one type of bat call. And in the middle, there's another type of bat call. Let's hear. I hope everyone was able to hear it. The first time I heard these kind of calls, and that's when I decided that I wanted to study bats. So here at the bottom, you can see the spectrogram or the visual representation of that chip, 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 chip call. So it looks very different from what it looks like when we speak. So in the beginning of the call recording, there was a key sound. So that's another type of bat. We'll talk more about it as I go along. But then, of course, all of this begs one question. Why is it that bats even use high frequency sounds? Why can't they make do with lower frequencies? One reason is because of what they eat, insects. For example, say you had a small grain of rice and you wanted to measure its length. And you have two scales with you. One is your standard 15 centimeter scale, and the other one is a scale which can measure only in meters, 1 meter, 2 meter, and 3 meter. Which of these scales would you even use to measure that grain of rice? Obviously, it's the small scale, right? So which means that you want to use a scale which is very similar to the object that you're measuring. So bats want to effectively detect or measure the size of insects, which are small. So the wavelength of the sound they use has to be small, which means that the frequency has to be high. So that's why bats use high frequency sounds. So I'm going to play a small video for you, which shows how bats hunt their prey. I'm going to play that again. Wonderful. So then, because of this amazing ability to echolocate, they're able to colonize and live in all kinds of different environments on the planet. But we're also transforming our environment in drastic ways, right? Humans are doing that. For example, almost 40% of our environment is converted into agriculture. Most of our forests are converted into agriculture. So usually, when you convert a land into agriculture, all the trees are either chopped off, or if it's a grassland, then all of the grass is removed and the crop is planted. But in some cases, like coffee, for example, you also need these trees for the coffee bush in the understory to grow. So you either start planting trees, more trees, or you leave some of the trees that were already there. So because of this, coffee plantations or farms look very similar to a forest. So scientists have even actually shown that biodiversity thrives when there are a lot of trees like this. So when biodiversity thrives, there are benefits to it. For example, scientists have also shown that bats, so here in this example, the scientists have looked at these 8 studies, and in each of these studies, they've shown that bats suppress the number of insects that are seen in the plantations. So the negative number, here shows that the number of insects are reducing. So in almost all of these kinds of agriculture, bats are able to suppress the number of harmful insects. But of course, all plantations or farms are not the same. Unlike the earlier picture that we saw of a coffee farm, this is a tea farm actually, which is sort of which has very, very few trees. And even coffee plantations sometimes have very few trees. So now the number of trees that are there will eventually affect the kind of bats that you see. Also, the distance of this agriculture from big natural forest areas like this also matters for bats. For example, the farm C, you would expect to see a lot more biodiversity or bats than a farm B, which is farther away from the forest. So keeping these in mind, I decided to go to one of the largest coffee growing areas in India, which is Chikmagalur district in Karnataka. So when I went there, before I went there, I was expecting two types of bats in that area. So one of these, which we saw earlier, the visual representation of the call is like this. So it starts, the bat calls at a very high frequency, and then it quickly comes down to a very low frequency with a very short span of time. So these are called frequency modulated or FM bats. So this is basically the sounds that you heard, the chip, 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 chip sound. So then the other type of bat I was expecting to hear are these constant frequency bats. So these bats are the key sound that you heard in the recording. So one thing scientists have already seen is that this FM bats actually hunt in the edges of vegetation, whereas the CF bats, they tend to hunt in very, very dense vegetation. So this is how tree density can impact the kind of bats that you see in the landscape. So this is a map of of where I did my research. So here you'll see all these square blocks, which are the farms that I actually went to, the coffee farms. And then these dark gray areas are the forest areas. And there are, of course, other areas like open areas, and then also buildings and cities. So this is an instrument that I use to actually listen to the bats. So this is called a bat detector or an ultrasound detector. It has a mic up here, and it listens to the high frequency calls that are being emitted by the bat, and then it converts it into a level which we can actually hear. So in my study, I heard about 9 species. So I didn't know exactly what I was listening to, because you cannot simply, it's very hard to hear bats or identify bats when you're only hearing them. You need to actually catch them and measure them, and then only you'll be able to say which kind of bat it is. But because I didn't do that, I just gave them artificial names, depending on their frequency. So the first set of bats that I heard were these. So as you saw earlier, these are FM bats because their calls look very different, high frequency to low frequency in a very, very short span of time. So these hunt at the edges of vegetation, and they tend to look something like this. Notice the huge ears and the small eyes, because the listening is very important to them. The ears are very big. Then you have these constant frequency calls, which are very, as the name suggests, they're constant like this. But look at the kind of frequencies that they're emitting at. This is 100 kilohertz. This is almost 5 times the hearing capacity of us humans. So these, as we said earlier, hunt in dense spaces, very, very high tree density. Right. So then I decided to see whether as you go away from the forest and as you increase the tree density, what happens to the activity of these bats. So the activity is nothing but essentially the number of bats that you're seeing. So let's go and look at each graph one by one. In the first graph A, on the x-axis is the mean tree density per hectare. A hectare is a rectangle of 100 by 100 meters. So the tree density goes from 250 trees per hectare to almost 1,000. So on the y-axis here, it's just if I was sampling, for example, for say 10 minutes, then how many of those minutes where did I actually detect a bat? For example, I was sampling for 10 minutes and I detected a bat in 5 of those minutes, then the proportion is 0.5. So as you can see here, as the tree density increases, there is no real pattern to what happens to the activity. So it's all over the place. So there is no real pattern. Similarly, when you see an increase in the proportion of built-up area is nothing but the presence of buildings or houses in that landscape. I'm pretty sure that many of you have noticed small bats that are flying around as soon as it is dusk. Where are those bats coming from? They're roosting in your buildings. So as the number of buildings increases, even then you do not see any real pattern to the activity or the number of FM bats that you're seeing. The same thing happens with distance from forests. So when you're close to the forest, you see a lot of activity here, but even when you're far, you still see high activity. So essentially, there was no real change in the activity or the number of bats as you changed all these parameters. So what happens to the constant frequency bats? You'll see again that there's no real pattern in any of these graphs A, B, and C. But what you do notice is that the activity or the numbers are fewer. So there is something there, meaning that the CF bats are probably less active and less common than the FM bats. So what does this all tell us? I mean, there's very little response here. What does this tell us at all? Firstly, it's possible that the bats are very flexible in their use of their surroundings. When I say flexible, it means that they don't simply drop out as soon as the number of trees increase, or they don't simply drop out as soon as the distance from the forest increases. It means that they're very adaptable. But what it also means is that this is a conclusion from only one study. We actually need more studies in different landscapes across India and across the world to really understand what's happening to the bats as we transform the environment in many ways. But there are also some vulnerable bats, vulnerable meaning that they're still very prone to problems when all these changes happen. One of the bats that I detected very, very few times is this one. It's called the lesser woolly horseshoe bat. It's an amazing bat which calls at around 40 kilohertz. It needs nice caves or spaces between huge boulders to roost. So when farms actually remove that kind of an environment, then these bats are still very vulnerable. At the same time, the tree densities are still high compared to other coffee growing regions in the world. So that's why even when within that range the tree density comes down, you still see a lot of bats because overall they're still higher than many parts of the world. That's pretty much it. So I want to thank, first of all, Yashwant, who helped me a lot in my fieldwork, all the coffee farmers who invited me onto their farms to help to sample the bats, Dr. Mahesh and Kriti, who are my advisors, Dr. Jayashree, Ajit, who again run the MSc Wildlife Program, and everyone at the communications office and Professor Saudamini who put this together. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Shasank. I will now ask Mayukh to begin.
Yes. So I'll just share my screen. Should I begin?
Yes, please.
All right. So actually, before I begin, I want all of you to just to listen. For the next one and a half minutes, I'll be playing a sound, and I'll talk about it later on. But I want you to listen at this point. Sorry. what happens when you rely on sound to communicate and navigate and search for food. And you have this extremely loud noise that comes in the background. You can't hear each other, you can't hear yourself. So the most animals that have evolved in water. Water is a very visually limited system. If you look into any of our rivers or even in the ocean, vision is only limited to a few meters. But sound, because of its properties, it's a much better medium of exchanging information. So sound travels 5 times faster underwater. So it's only natural that animals that have evolved to live in their watery worlds have evolved the use of sound in their everyday function. The sounds that you were hearing initially, all those pops, grunts, all these weird noises were all fishes. And yes, this is the river Ganga, and they come alive at night completely. The clicks that you were hearing were Ganges river dolphins. So it's a very sonically active world, even though at the surface we don't really see anything, but underwater we hear a lot. And a lot of people have actually studied the effects of noise on animals, and most of these studies have happened in ocean systems, where a lot of people have found that and when you have a noise source in the area, a lot of animals tend to either move away from the place, or they become either permanently or temporarily deaf, or they increase their output. You know how in a noisy restaurant you would probably want to shout more to hear one another. The same thing happens with these animals. But a more insidious thing occurs as well. A lot of animals try to beach themselves. So these are pilot whales, where they come out of the water and they beach themselves to get away from the noise. And a very famous example is what happened in the Bahamas with the US Navy actually testing their sonar. And it caused these are deep dwelling animals. They live at about 1,000 meters. These are beaked whales. And they caused them to come out and beach themselves. And thankfully, what they've done is they cut off the head and they took it to a center to scan it. And what they found was that these little black and white size that you see there, those are actually blood clots in their internal ear. So they found internal hemorrhaging that had happened. And all of this is great because, it's not great. It's great to know that this has happened in animals that have evolved in space in oceans that aren't exactly limited by space. But the same thing is happening to rivers. A lot of the rivers are used as waterways to transport goods and materials. So you have a lot of boats coming in. So what happens to animals that live in these restricted environments where you just have a certain width of the river and a bit of depth? What happens to these animals that live in these sort of restricted conditions? And that's what we've set out to do for our study. Before I begin, I want to tell you why it's important to use sound to understand this particular animal, because and that's it. That's all that you see of the river dolphin. It comes out for barely a second, breathes, and goes back in. There is no way you can tell anything about the animal, its ecology, biology, how it feeds, how it communicates. So it's very important to use the Umwelt of the animal. And this is a concept, this is a German term, where people try to, the Umwelt is how an animal perceives its surroundings and what is important to it. So to us humans being visual creatures, it's very, very difficult for us to comprehend what a dolphin can see or do. And these animals don't see that way. So we have to step into the Umwelt of these animals, and they actually use sound to do it. So as I mentioned, they've evolved in mostly sediment-rich rivers, such as in the Indian subcontinent, which includes the Ganga and the Brahmaputra and its tributaries. And as you can see in this image, their eyes are basically a pinhole, and they see as well as we see when we close our eyes and we look around. We just see light and dark. And because of this, they rely completely on sound to communicate, navigate, and even hunt for food. And a lot of scientists in the 1980s have studied them, and they term these animals as continuous transmitters. They talk all the time. And the reason why noise is so problematic for this animal, apart from it being using sound exclusively, is that 90% of the Ganges River dolphins range coincides with the National Waterways Project, which is basically they want to transfer the amount of goods from railways and roads onto rivers, which includes this entire armada of barges carrying coal and a whole lot of other stuff. This will inevitably lead to a lot of noise in the river. And we don't really know what these sort of impacts have on an animal that rely exclusively on sound, or for that matter, actually, so the river dolphin is a very nice case study. We don't even know what happens to fishes for that matter. Just to describe why it's important in a shallow water, sound behaves like a completely different beast underwater. If you have this point source of sound, which is represented by this red dot, underwater, when it propagates equally in all directions until it hits the surface or the bottom. At that point of time, there's reflection, and some of the energy gets reflected back, and some gets absorbed. And depending on the depth of the water, it depends how much reflection is going to be there. So essentially, shallower the water, the more reflection, the more the sound persists. And having these as baselines, what we asked were, what are the effects of vessel noise along with the different depths of water on the acoustic behavior of dolphins? And what does it mean in terms of the river dolphins' metabolic cost? Like, how stressful is the environment? What we imagined was that during intermittent noise condition, when you have like just one boat passing by, they'd suppress that activity. I mean, similar to how we do it. If there's a really loud noise source outside, we tend to shut up for a bit. Whereas under chronic noise conditions, as in a very loud restaurant, you want to be able to hear one another, so you shout more. So we expected them to do the same. And to do this study, we conducted the study in the floodplains of Bihar, on the Ganges River. And the yellow box out here delineates the Vikramshila River Dolphin Sanctuary. And it's a really beautiful landscape, actually, if none of you have visited. You've got vast tracts of grassland with nilgai running around. You've got lots of endangered animals like these greater adjutants, otters. You've got river islands in between. You've got these isolated channels that form when the river recedes during the dry season. You've got this expanse of silt and alluvial soil. And of course, you have a lot of rivers that merge in with the main Ganga. So to the left is the Kosi, and to the right, the greenish translucent one is the Ganga. As you can see, there's a lot of sediment mixing that happens, and a lot of river dolphins tend to focus on in and around these confluences as well. We recorded using this thing called the hydrophone, which is this black blob here, and it's connected to a recorder. And it's a very nifty tool because you can actually hear the sounds, but it's also very costly in terms of how much data it actually receives. Whereas this instrument is called a CPOD, cetacean and porpoise detector. What it does is it doesn't record sound, but it records its characters. Like Shasank mentioned, it records its frequency, its amplitude. So it doesn't necessarily overload it, and you can deploy it for longer. And before I go in further, just a few terms that I want to clarify right now. Yeah, what you hear in the background are river dolphins. Those are its individual clicks represented in a spectrogram. But river dolphins, they click, their calls range from 20 kilohertz to all the way to 160 kilohertz. That goes beyond some bats as well, of course not. So it's really high frequency, and we obviously cannot hear them. So the reason why we can is because if you slow it down, you can perceive its sound as well. So the sound has been slowed down 4 times. So interclick interval is basically the distance between these 2 clicks in terms of seconds. Train duration. A train is a very arbitrary concept where you look at a series of clicks and the difference between them. So if I have 10 clicks with 10 sequential clicks with 2 seconds of difference, and then again 10 other clicks, these 2 become 2 different trains. So train duration is basically how long those click trains last for. So it could be short, it could be long. You also have the number of clicks that are given in a train. So for a given train, I can have anywhere from 5 clicks to 100 clicks. It just means how intensely I'm producing something. And click rate is basically how many clicks I have in a second. They're not really correlated much. So what we found was that if you look at the x-axis out here is the ambient noise level, and the y can be any variable. Right now, it's train duration. What this basically says is that during the month of November, the ambient vessel movement out here, pre meaning that there was no vessel movement in the river. During is when obviously the vessel was moving. So what we find is that during the during conditions of no vessel movement, the ambient noise level hovers around 40 decibels, and that's really, really quiet. And when there's a boat passing by, the decibels shoot up to close to 130, 140 decibels. And sound underwater is far more intense because it also travels faster and is conserved. So 140 decibels underwater is incredibly loud. The scaling factor is somewhere around 30, 40 decibels. I'm not really sure, but it's definitely much louder underwater. And what you see is, as you move from November all the way to March, you see that the difference between when vessels are moving and when vessels are not moving tends to decrease. And this happens simply because if you look at this lower graph, the number of boats that move on an average per hour increases quite a lot. So from almost 1 to 2 boats per hour, you move on to almost 10 boats per hour. That's a boat, that's a very high amount of vessel traffic. And up here, up top, is one of the variables out here. So if I divide it based on months, the blue is November, December, January, and this is March. So what happens is the blue line is the baseline level when there is no vessels around. And the red is when you have boats moving around. And what this graph just very basically shows is that whenever you have a boat, the dolphins tend to have more clicks in their train. But when in the month of March, when you have a lot of boat in the river, their baseline itself reduces, and so does their response as well. So how do we summarize it? If you have a river dolphin, basically when boats pass by, it has a lot of clicks in its trains, which means it's spending a lot more energy in putting out those clicks. And it's actually, it lowers its frequency and increases its amplitude. So it shifts its frequency as well. Whereas in a highly motorized vessel traffic area, you still have slightly higher click rates, but not as high. The baseline itself has also decreased. And they've resorted to high frequency of clicks with low amplitude. Now, here's a trade-off between frequency and amplitude. From the perspective of an animal, you cannot have high frequency sound and be loud as well, because a lot of reflection will happen from whatever is there in your environment, and you won't be able to perceive it well. So you call at a higher frequency, but you reduce the loudness. So essentially, these dolphins, when there are a lot of boats moving around, they're scanning really close to one another. They can't really scan for long distances. Another concept that we try to establish is what happens to their communication, actually. So, I mean, yes, I'm altering my frequency, I'm not being loud, but what does it mean for a dolphin if it has to communicate with one another? So this we try to do by looking in something called a masking range. If you imagine you have a dolphin, which is approximately around 10 meters, near 10 meters of the boat, and the boat is creating some noise. The dolphin also sends out some signal. And you have another dolphin that's supposed to be a receiver. So what masking range does is that it tells us the cutoff distance that a particular dolphin needs to be able to hear a dolphin. So under certain noise conditions, what is the safe distance within which they can hear one? And this is a visual representation of the dolphin clicks for a given second. And this is what happens when a vessel moves by. Visually, we can see that it completely masks the dolphin click. But what does it mean in terms of, can we put a distance to it? So what this shows us, what this shows us is that you have the green shaded area is the inaudible range. They can't hear any sounds that are quieter than 80 decibels or say 10 kilohertz. And anything above this is what they can hear. And the greater the difference is between these vessels from this green line, the louder that particular vessel is. So this vessel type called ferry that we've categorized it as is the loudest, as its difference between this line is the greatest. And how do we translate that to distance? If we concentrate on the frequency at the x-axis as a 60 kilohertz sound, so the dolphin, a receiver dolphin, needs to be within approximately 50 meters of the sender dolphin to be able to hear that particular frequency of sound. And in a river, and that's really startling. So all of this is problematic because rivers are really constrained systems. The dolphin can't really run away like most marine mammals can. And so what we found was in our summary is that under intermittent noise conditions, they actually shout a lot more. So they keep saying that if I were to translate it in terms of human speech, they keep saying the same thing over and over again. They shout a lot more. But under chronic noise conditions, they actually suppress their activity. They literally whisper because shouting continuously is really energetically costly. I cannot keep shouting. And as you can see, I'm already gasping for a breath of air. And the same goes for the dolphin. And what does it mean for its changing soundscapes? What we showed is that they've consistently altered their acoustic behavior based on the exposure of the vessel. And what our results also show is that the current trajectory of vessel movement can double the ambient noise levels in the river, which would essentially mean that the dolphins may not be able to cope with the noise because it's so costly to produce sound. They might actually not produce, they might perform really poorly in terms of how much sound they produce. And we showed that it's based on, depending on how loud the vessel is and how much of a sonar it actually uses to chart the bathymetry of the river, it can be problematic for the river dolphin. And of course, it's another separate part of the study which I left out, but based on the availability of the fish and how much the noise persists in the water, and because these dolphins have to continuously transmit sound, it can be really costly living in a noisy underwater. And yeah, that's it. I'd like to thank my funders, my field assistants who've helped me consistently, my advisors, people who've actually lent me the equipment to do the study, the folks from the MSc program, and folks from Bihar, and of course the forest department and the police communication team. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mayukh. This was really interesting, and I mean, I'm sure everyone has learned a lot about these, acoustic studies from both of you. So I think we can take some questions, and we have one hand that's raised. So Pradnya, go ahead and ask your question, please, and then we'll get to some of the other questions in the Q&A box. Pradnya, please go ahead.
Yeah,
I want to put this.
No questions.
Okay, no question. Okay, then I'd request that you lower your hand. Anyone who wants to ask can raise their hand, but right now we'll go to one of the questions in the Q&A box. Janvi Shah asks, what about fruit bats? What are their frequencies? I guess this was during your talk, so.
Yeah, so can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Good question, that is. The answer is that fruit bats do not use any high frequency sounds to navigate or fly about. So it's only the insectivorous bats that do that. So the reason is that, well, they don't have the infrastructure or the physiologically, they're not capable of doing this. They rely more on their eyesight, the fruit bats. So one of the easiest ways to tell a fruit bat from a insectivorous bat is to, I wouldn't entirely recommend this, but if you shine a torchlight towards the bat, if the eyes shine like that of a dog or a cat, then it's most likely to be a fruit bat, because they depend on their eyesight their eyes are big. They also have this layer on the retina, which increases the amount of light that is coming in. So this doesn't happen for insectivorous bats because they're relying more on their ears.
Okay, I guess that's a good enough answer for that question. And I mean, what about sorry, one second, the Q&A has disappeared. Yeah, sorry. The next question would be for Mayukh, and someone has asked, can you use satellite tagging and GoPros while you're trying to do the recording of the sounds of the dolphins and things?
Yeah, actually, yes, you can, provided you have the right amount of funding and you get the permits from the government to tag a Schedule 1 animal, which we don't usually get. So we have to rely on acoustics as a way to do it. And to be honest, the satellite tags are also, they work well with marine mammals, because these guys, they dive down and they come back up and they stay at the surface for much longer, and the signals get transmitted when they are actually at the surface, not underwater. So for a dolphin, we'd just be able to see what they're doing at the surface when they come up for air. But if you want to actually know what the dolphin is doing underwater, some of these tags also have acoustic sensors as well. So you can also record and look at how fast they're going, as well as look at where they come up. So a combination would work. Purely satellite, probably not the best.
Oh, okay. I see. So I guess we are done with that question. And Shashank, someone is asking you, did you notice any temporal acoustic niche partitioning among different bat species? So
Yeah. So again, a very good question. So one of the limitations of my study was that I did not sample for bats throughout the night. So it's very likely that if I did sample throughout the night, then I would see some bats more active in the beginning of the night and some active later on in the night to sort of make sure that they're not interfering with each other. But that usually does happen. As far as that's one way to answer the question. If the question is whether bats actually use different frequencies at all in when they're navigating in the same environment, then you see that some of the species that I detected, there were some differences, like 20 kilohertz and then 30 kilohertz. Some bats call around 60 kilohertz. So you see that kind of frequency differentiation also, even if both the bats are hunting at the same point of time. So they won't really hear each other, or they'll be sort of, there won't be any interference from the other bats that way.
Okay, I see. So what was the time that you were kind of studying at? Sorry if this is a repetition, but
Yeah. So I was, for various reasons, I did my sampling only between sunset and till about 10 to 11 p.m.
okay, right. Just in case anyone wanted to know that. Someone has asked a kind of long question. I would say, Shashank, you can go through that while I ask Mayukh this question. Mayukh, is there any report of seasonal acoustic activity from a place with no motorized traffic area? And what if it changes due to breeding season or something like that?
Okay, so no motorized vessel traffic area doesn't exist. Sure, they're intermittent every now and then. As far as seasonal studies go, nothing yet. It's only just begun in the past couple of years. Studies on monitoring populations using acoustics. So I don't know if the results are out yet. The second question was, sorry.
Yeah, so it says, what if it changes due to breeding season or something like
Yeah,
that?
so these measures that we're talking about, I don't expect them to change based on seasons. And of course, they have a breeding season where they obviously calf. But the kind of okay, how do I put it? So these are traits that the frequency wouldn't change, or the train duration. These are physical characters of the sound that probably wouldn't change. But what would change are the patterns. So how their spacing clicks from one another. So the kind of analysis and the kind of insights that you would get would be very different. You'd look at patterns of calls rather than exactly what the frequencies are. Those are just the byproducts, the frequencies, but the patterns are what's more important. So no, we haven't done that yet, actually. So we do have calls that are exclusively feeding calls. We do have calls that are exclusively mostly contact calls between mother and calf. And those are the kind of things that we can definitely tell you.
Oh, okay. So I guess this is something that you'd be doing in the future as well, right? With the
Yeah,
hopefully.
hopefully.
Right. Shashank, why don't you go ahead with that question from Vaishnavi?
Yeah, that's a really good question because that's the main challenge for bats, how to differentiate the echoes that are coming back from food with respect to the echoes that are coming off of bouncing off of other objects in the in the environment. So that is one reason, of course, why, as I mentioned in the presentation, these FM bats tend to hunt only in the edges of the vegetation because they don't really want to get into really dense vegetation because then they'll be confused. There'll be a lot of interference. But even when they do hunt, of course, at the edges of the vegetation, like along a fence or something like that, there'll of course be interference. What really happens is a lot of these bats, they are hunting aerial insects, which is bats, insects that are flying around. So from the echoes that are returning from these insects, they seem to perceive some sort of a glint, like the sound bounces off of these wings which are flapping. So every time uh, the sound hits a flapping wing of the insect and then comes back, these are perceived as some sort of like really short peaks in the background, in the echoes that are coming back to the bat. So they're able to perceive those peaks in the background echoes, and they're able to narrow down where the food is. And then, of course, they emit more and more when they start to notice that there is an insect there. More and more frequently, the calls come faster. So yeah, I mean, I'm not really familiar with the actual really nitty-gritties of it, but that's pretty much how I do it.
Okay, that's a pretty good answer for a complicated question. So we have one person who's raised their hand, Harshit Mishra. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, go ahead.
So my question is about the Masters in Wildlife program. So can I ask it first of all? Hello?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So my question is to both the presenters, Shashank and Mayukh. So I wanted to know how the interview process is. I mean, on the website, it's given that you come for a panel interview and you give an interview. So if you can describe your interview in a very brief way, I think that would be very beneficial for me because I am looking forward to join this program if I get selected after the exam.
Okay, maybe Jayashree, you want to take this one?
Yeah, that would also be very nice.
Yeah.
Harshit,
Yes.
I think you may want to come offline to us with this question because it is slightly tangential to the topics that we're talking about today. But if you send us if we can chat later and I can tell you a little bit more about the interview process, or perhaps at the end when we finish talking about all the subject material. Okay, I'll get back.
Yeah. So I think that would be good, and we'll just get back to the questions. Yeah. So here, someone is asking two questions to Mayukh. Why is it important for dolphins to communicate with each other? And the other one is kind of already mentioned. You've already spoken about that. So yeah, the question about communication. Why do they need to communicate with each other?
Well, for a variety of reasons. They sometimes engage in cooperative hunting as well. Well, not in the way that you see in the marine dolphins, but yeah, when you have a feeding frenzy going on, a lot of dolphins will come together and feed. They communicate one another to definitely. These are solitary, sort of solitary. They don't really move around in pods, but they do have their own little territories, and they have a lot of territorial calls. So sort of like back off. This is my area. So you would want to tell the others that this is sort of my territory. Please don't come in a more aggressive way. And of course, a mother and a calf would obviously need to stay in touch with one another. It's not that they're always together, but there is a fair bit of distance between them. And if you've seen the Ganga, you can't really see even 1 feet into the water. So you definitely need sounds to have these sort of contacts. So depending on the context, you have contact calls, you have aggression calls, you have eating behaviors, cooperative, that sort of thing.
Right. So I guess that's pretty necessary, and we all need to communicate in some way or the other. So another question for you is, so what happens if a dolphin undergoes permanent deafness? Are they able to navigate, or do they sort of do the beaching, or what kind of happens with them?
Okay, so I don't exactly know. Definitely, we have no idea about river dolphins. For marine dolphins, they talk about permanent threshold shifts. So deafness in a sense that they won't be able to hear a particular frequency of sound. They because it's become quieter. So it's partial temporary. It's partial deafness, but that's more permanent. It's not complete. And moreover, they also rely on vision, not entirely, because you can still see a few meters ahead of you in the marine system. In the riverine world, I do not know. I don't know. I don't know. We haven't had any documented reports of deafness because there's no way we'd be able to tell. We cannot definitely take a carcass of a dolphin and put it in a machine to see what's happening inside. There's no way we can tell that. And yeah, so short answer is we don't.
Okay, I see. And Shashank, someone is asking, is ambient noise affecting bats' echolocation in the same way that affects dolphins? Do you have any idea about that? Sorry, you're still
Right,
muted.
yeah. Yeah, there are studies on how it's affecting bats as well. Something similar happens. I mean, they start calling at higher frequencies, but I'm not entirely familiar with that literature. But I can say this: a lot of the sounds that come in the environment, in the terrestrial environment, are not really that high frequency per se. I mean, that's one of the reasons also one of the reasons why bats tend to call it high frequencies, with less interference from any kind of ambient noise. But of course, when there is any high frequency ambient noise, they do tend to call higher, but it really becomes very problematic because they're really tuned to hearing the echoes at that um, those high frequencies. If they go even higher, then they may not be able to really listen to the returning echoes and stuff. But it definitely is a problem, but perhaps not as of a really pressing problem as that is for dolphins.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. And then there are a few more questions about, the dolphins. So, are there any acoustic dampeners which can be used to quieten the boat noise, for instance?
No, I mean not really. There's a lot of evidence to show that simple technical modifications in the propeller itself can cut down noise significantly. So the noise that comes out off of these boats that are high frequency is basically what's called a cavitation noise. These are bubbles that are produced as the propellers turn underwater, and these bubbles burst. And depending on the size of the bubbles, it produces different frequencies. So the high frequency sounds from boats are usually generated at the propellers. And also you have sonar, but that's separate. So if you just change, if you make it a little more, just some modifications to its structure, like you have in an airplane, the wings are tipped at the end. So if you have certain things like that, or if you puncture a bit of holes in the propeller itself, that cuts down noise from the propeller, and it also increases the fuel efficiency of the vessel. So yeah, it hasn't been done. But there are a lot of hydrodynamic studies around propellers to show that how you can cut it out. So
Okay, I see. And I guess all of these things are things that would, require cooperation from the people who are using those,
yes.
instruments and machines and things like that. And I think that goes well into the question that I'd like to address to both of you. Um, what is the social aspect of wildlife biology and conservation, which is, really prominent for both of you while you've been in the field? What have you noticed, especially? Either of you can start.
For sure.
Okay. So I think I'll be really frank that these kinds of research, at least at least that show what benefits biodiversity provides in general to agriculture, they don't mean much if the farmers are not able to make any changes to their farming practices for any reason whatsoever. For example, as far as the tree density is concerned, I'm going to say that increasing tree density is beneficial for biodiversity, or is beneficial for bats also, as opposed to say removing all trees and keeping really very low tree density. Now, the cutting of the trees depends on a lot of factors. For example, the farmer cuts the tree, then usually for timber. So he has to sell that timber, right? Then what kind of price is he getting for that timber? Whether they're even able to cut trees and sell, because often there are rules against cutting trees. There are rules in the law which are against cutting trees and all that. So it really, for my study in particular, I mean, I can't just say that, bats require this kind of an environment to thrive. So do this, because it has to fit in to what kind of impacts that those farming practices are having across the board, for other people, for workers who are working on the plantations, for other biodiversity like insects and birds and so on. So it's a whole, one thing is for sure is that you can't do, it's very, very, very hard to do both the ecological aspects of and as well as the social aspects of these kind of studies. You need like solid training to do both, and it's very, very challenging indeed.
Yeah, for Bihar, it's pretty much what Shasank mentioned as well. It's kind of challenging to do both. So although my time on field has taught me about what has been happening in the region, so the national waterway, if I'm allowed to speak about it, is ensures that these rivers are turned into canals, and basically you dredge the river to maintain a minimum depth of water. Even though these are seasonal rivers, they flood and they recede. And on top of this, you have the vision is that anywhere between Allahabad to Haldia, if you stand every 20 minutes, you'll see a barge going up with coal up and down. That's horrendous for some of us ecologists. But if you think about it in the more social science aspect, a lot of fisherfolk depend on the river for their necessities. These are a lot of artisanal fishermen. And what happens in a river traffic where in a river where you keep dredging all the time and you have continuous vessel movement, you cannot set your nets out, you cannot fish properly. So your access to the river also gets cut out. And on top of this, a lot of these fishermen are tuned really well with the ecology of the fish. So there are certain fish that you get only in the rocky part of the river, or certain fish that you get only in the muddy substrate. And every time you dredge, you change the profile of the river. And that means that the fish itself can possibly get displaced. So yes, to ask a question that that looks at the social context of this, that ties in with the ecology, is definitely needed. And yeah, so the short answer is that yes, people are affected as well, and they're not really taken into consideration as much as dolphins.
Yeah, I think that would be something that even maybe Jayashree could say something about. Jayashree, would you like to add anything to what Mayukh and Shashank have said?
Yes. So I think I want to echo both their sentiments in that while you can study the biology, and through the biology you can make prescriptions for what is needed to be done to conserve the species from that angle, from the perspective of its biology and for the populations to be healthy. In order for these to actually be implemented, they must also be compatible with the socio-ecological conditions in which that population occurs. So in the case of, say, Mayukh's problem, you've got the dolphin, what's happening? We've got the dolphins, what's happening to them because of the motorized vessels, but also the livelihoods of fishermen who are dependent on the river and fishing for making their living. So it's really a complicated process, and there are no simple solutions. And what really has to happen is that at each site and at each location, we have to identify the different prongs of the problem, right? The economics that goes with the water highways, the economics that goes with the fisheries, the health of the dolphin populations, the health of the fish populations. And we have to work together with all the communities and institutions involved to try and get at solutions. So I should say that at some level, understanding and describing the biology is probably the simplest part of a very complex problem. And but that doesn't mean we shouldn't approach it. I mean, it just makes it more of a challenge. But we do need to do all of this to conserve both our wild animals, the livelihoods of people that depend on natural ecosystems and the wild animals, as well as keep a functioning economy. So it is no small challenge, but one that we should be thinking about a lot as we go into a future where you're going to have more and more of such problems.
Thanks, Jayashree. I think that sums up the this answer. Um, so we'll try and go through a few more of the questions very quickly. We're running out of time. If anyone would like to ask it live, please raise your hand and do that. Apart from that, Shashank, there's a question about why you didn't catch any bats. And I mean, I'm sure there are many reasons why you shouldn't be catching the bats to conduct this kind of acoustic research. Can you shed some light?
Right. So there were no ethical or moral issues for me per se. The only thing was that I wasn't trained enough. That's simply the answer. I'm not trained to catch bats. That requires a lot of good training. So you don't harm the bat. You treat them well because they're very sensitive animals. You hold them and you catch them. They get tangled in the net. You need to know how to remove it properly. You need to know how to process it quickly enough and then release it. Yeah. So I'm not trained in that kind of thing. But as far as would it have helped if I had caught and then recorded the frequencies? Yeah, absolutely. You can make call libraries and then you can use those call libraries to match what you're recording with the library and then identify the species. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Mayukh, someone is asking, are there any natural predators of the dolphin in the river habitat? And does the acoustic hindrance also affect their ability to communicate alarm calls if they are being predated upon, kind of?
Yeah, I mean, the hindrance part it applies to all calls regardless of their function. So that's one. As opposed to any natural predators, no, not really. I mean, if I'd imagine that there are there are stories from field that talk about this particular catfish called the Bagarius yareli, or the Bagarius bagarius, either of them. This is called the goonch catfish. It grows to monstrous proportions. So there are some stories that say that this catfish can possibly predate on a calf of a dolphin, which can be just less than 50 centimeters to some extent. So yeah, the only predation that can possibly happen is probably there, but we don't have any evidence. Otherwise, no, they're not really predated upon.
Okay, thanks. And someone is asking about the marked decrease in noise pollution in the environment. Is that really true during the lockdown? And does this sudden decrease affect the fruit bat communication? I'm not sure that this would be something you can shed light on, Shashank, because
I'm not entirely sure that it's going to affect fruit bat communication per se. They rely a lot on the vision, and I'm not entirely sure. Yeah.
right. Okay. Fair enough. And someone else is asking, why would dolphins or whales choose to beach themselves when the noise is unbearable? As you mentioned in the beginning, like they experienced hemorrhages during, sonar tests and things like that. Is it possible for them to move away from the sonar waves rather than beach themselves? I'm just wondering.
Yeah, so usually what happens is you're caught between what phrase, a rock and a hard place, something like that. So
Right.
so you have a wall of sound that's generated by a ship, and you happen to be between land and the area. And this could be kilometers, by the way, because sound really travels for kilometers. So you can be kilometers away from the shore, and yet you'd have a vessel that's on this side, probably, that's blocking your exit. So your only chance is to go farther away from it. So you usually tend to go off into these places. And the places where these breaches have occurred, are mostly have the Bahamas are like a set of islands. So regardless of where you go, you do find land. So it's just bad luck as well, I guess. But if you happen to be on the other side of the boat, then sure, you can run away to deeper parts. But yeah.
Right. Okay. Great. And so I think we'll just do one last quick question, and that is, sorry, where's the question? Yeah. So, um, yeah. Do the Gangetic dolphins show friendly human behavior?
I don't think so. I don't think they can see us well, and they'd probably just perceive if you were to stand by the shore and try to feed them or pet them. You obviously can't pet them. But no, I don't. Short answer: no, I don't think they show any human-friendly behavior. But yeah, no.
Well, okay, good to know. Okay, so thank you so much, and I think this was a very interactive session. Also, so many questions, we didn't answer all of them. But I think I'll just quickly ask Jayashree if she wants to say anything to wind up and mention sort of the wildlife program and
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. So for Harshit, who asked the questions about the wildlife program, well, we welcome people who are really interested in nature and want to conserve it. But of course, we have a pretty rigorous selection process. So you have to do a national entrance exam, you get through it, and then you have, from there, people get shortlisted for interviews, and interviews basically ask you about, try to, understand what you know about the subject, why you want to do this discipline, and what you might end up doing if you were to join the course and how it would benefit you. So it's very hard to give you a simple prescriptive answer that if you do this, you will get in, or if you do that, you won't get in. All I can say is do your best. If you're really interested and passionate and you work hard to understand the discipline and get experience and come in with that, then you have a good chance of getting it. For those who want to know more about this program and what it does and the recruitment process, please, we have a website for the master's program. And if you go to the NCBS website, you will find us, and you can come to our program website and find out more about what happens. But as a last point, I should say that even though even though all around us, we hear a lot of stories of gloom and doom in nature, habitats are fragmenting, species are being lost, we're in the middle of a mass epidemic. And now, we've had this pandemic after which, the world needs to really restart economic activity, a lot of which is going to even further threaten our wildlife and wild places. And of course, all of this is happening in the background of climate change. So sometimes it may seem, so all I can say is, even though it seems difficult, it is more urgent than ever that young people stand up and get trained and speak and work for nature and its conservation. So I welcome all of you who are interested. It is a very rewarding life. Okay.
Thank you so much. I'd just like to invite Saudamini and Mahin to make any closing comments. If they...
Yeah.
I'm not going to make any closing comments. I think we've kept people online for an hour and a half. Just want to say thank you to everyone for coming and for the presenters for presenting, and to Saudamini for the idea for this. And that's it. That's all from me.
Saudamini?
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Jayashree, Mayukh and Shasank for this very, very interesting theme of talks on the theme of acoustics, and we all got got into a very engaging sort of conversation. And this is going to be fun to follow up. And from the video that you have sent, we will keep in touch. And thanks once again.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'll be closing the call now.